Hello guys, welcome back to my channel, and as always, before we go on to the video, if you really like my content in terms of both science, literature, and just bookish discussions in general, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe before we go on to jump into this Halloween type of video basically for you guys. So in this video, basically, I wanted to have a quick look back into what really got me into horror. As for those of you who've been around my channel for quite some time, you might already know that I really tend to enjoy the horror genre, as is clearly evident by the amount of Stephen King books I've frequently read and reviewed. Well, even besides the Stephen King books of which I've read, in general, I've always been fascinated by the horror genre. And it pretty much started not with literature, but actually with cinema. So, there is an account of an early literature piece which I read when I was much younger, which already showed that I kind of really like the horror genre, but I wouldn't say that that is what mainly sparked my curiosity. No, what actually sparked my curiosity to read or to be just interested in the horror genre in general are actually slasher movies. I was actually a big fan of like old 60s, 70s, and 80s slasher movie in my early teenage years, and particularly I was really interested in the genre because of, I remember the remake of the Nightmare on Elm Street that came out, if I'm not mistaken, in 2010 or 2011-ish. When this movie came out, I was of course way too young to go to the theater and see it, and it was a bit of a bummer, and that actually in some sense created this reverse psychology sense, or this forbidden fruit type of syndrome thing, in which basically because I couldn't see the movie in the theater, I became very curious to see the movie, and eventually I did manage to go to like a local like DVD store in which I could have bought the DVD, even though the movie just came out. But yeah, details aside, I managed to get a DVD for the newly released Nightmare on Elm Street remake, and back then I really enjoyed it. So what happened after that was, because I really enjoyed the concept of like Freddy Krueger and slasher movies and such, I started digging even more into the story, because I was in essence very interested in the whole concept of Freddy Krueger, and I discovered the old Nightmare on Elm Street series, basically by Wes Craven. So I discovered the first Nightmare on Elm Street all the way to the basically final Nightmare on Elm Street movie, and I basically watched all of those, and from those I learned about the Jason movies as well, like Friday the 13th, and I watched some of the Friday the 13th movies as well, not all of them, but quite a couple of them. And on top of that, besides being interested in these slasher movies, at some point I was also interested in very old Universal Studio monsters, especially with me and my grandfather, who fortunately he passed away a couple of years ago, but basically both of us shared this liking for these old Universal Studio monsters basically. So I found myself becoming interested in those old movies like The Mummy with Boris Karloff from 1932, also the old Dracula movie, and The Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein, and all of these other like movies basically, and even the remake of Dracula, which was in 1950 something, I think, with Christopher Reeves, something along those lines, the guy that played Count Dooku in the Star Wars movies. And basically I really enjoyed all of these movies, and that got me even more into the horror genre, very slowly but surely. But I think at the end of the day, what solidified basically my liking for the horror genre in terms of like cinema was actually, and in terms of not just liking slasher movies, because at this point I was already into slasher movies and some like paranormal type of movies, because you know the Nightmare on Elm Street series had quite a bit of paranormal shenanigans going on. But what really solidified my liking for the horror genre in general, as to like discussing like movie terminologies and like movie histories, and really actually made me kind of a movie buff, was actually the movie Scream by, again, the director Wes Craven. I tend to notice, especially as to looking up names of movies and such for this video, that I tend to have quite a history with Wes Craven movies, and even some of the ones which haven't been very much critically acclaimed, like Dracula 2000. I actually really enjoyed that movie in which Gerard Butler basically played Dracula in, like, I think the year 2000. So I tend to really enjoy a lot of Wes Craven movies, and even his movie called Wes Craven's New Nightmare, in which it's like a fourth wall breaking thing that basically Freddy Krueger kind of leaps into the real world and kind of sees that it's all in movies, but he starts killing people in real life. Yeah, even for that movie good, but in principle, Scream was the movie basically that turned me from a simple, basically, person that just enjoys horror to someone that made horror pretty much his favorite genre. Like, I enjoy the concept. Of course, what is happening with the people in the movie itself is like really terrible, but I enjoy the concept of like the ghost face killer even more so than, for example, the killers in the A Nightmare on Elm Street series, like Freddy Krueger, or in the Friday the 13th movies, like the first one, Pamela Voorhees, or like Jason Voorhees and all of the other ones, or Michael Myers from the Halloween movies. Like, I found Ghostface to be the most intriguing like character of them all, for different reasons.
Sydney?
One of the main ones is that the movie is very self-aware of like horror movie tropes, and I think that kind of opened the way of me being very interested in like talking about movies and discussing movies even before I actually discovered like the movie category on YouTube with people like Jeremy Jahns, Chris Stuckman, or the Nostalgia Critic, and all of these other people. Like, before I even knew YouTube was a thing, I already became interested in talking about movies and learning about like movie, like cinema history and such, because I came to know some very interesting classics. And also I came to discover what I then didn't know about, which was the Hannibal movies basically. So especially those with Anthony Hopkins. Like, I know there's one called Mindhunter, I think, based off of the first book, like the Red Dragon book. But I'm mainly specifically talking about like the Silence of the Lambs, the Red Dragon, and like the Hannibal movies, all of which with Anthony Hopkins. Like, I watched those after having discovered Scream, and again, I really enjoy those. And it's been a goal of mine ever since I was younger to obtain the ghost face mask, as again, like, the character is one of my favorites, and I think I should justify it basically. That basically the reason why the ghost face killer is one of my favorites is, one, because he's human. Like, in all of the Scream movies, it's basically someone else adopting like the ghost face like costume and like taking on the identity of the Woodsboro serial killer. And it kind of humanizes it in the sense that basically he's not like Michael Myers, in which it's like a supernatural being that cannot be killed. He's not like a Freddy Krueger or something that only haunts you in your dreams. It's a concept which is pretty much grounded in reality in a lot of sense, in which basically, especially if you live in like a very urban area, and even in a big city, a big metropolitan area, you can have someone, just a crazy person, calling you with a voice changer and threatening you. Like, that's the stuff that happens in pretty much a lot of big cities nowadays. So I like the idea, and I of course really like the iconic voice by Roger L. Jackson that is typically associated with the ghost face like voice.
So, who are you?
The question isn't who am I? The question is, where am I?
So, where are you?
Your front porch.
Also, the first Scream movie had one of the best reveals, in my opinion. So when it comes to like a murder mystery clue type of thing, of course I haven't seen much of murder mystery clues, so maybe there are some even more mind-blowing stuff. Like, I know, for example, the John Carpenter The Thing movie also had really good suspense, and it's also one of those movies which also I really enjoyed when it comes to horror. But Really like that reveal, and recently I've actually gone through the whole Scream like series or franchise, you could say, up to the final Scream movie that came out earlier this year. And I still have to say that like I remember basically after watching these movies why I really like horror. From the scenes of which you have a combination of the tragedy that is Ghostface chasing his victims, combined with a little bit of the dark humor of him being very clumsy and like the victims actually fighting back, to basically the great like witty banter basically in which Ghostface always has with his victims, basically in which you see him giving them a trivia on horror movies and such. All of that basically makes Scream one of the best like Halloween binges in my opinion ever, from the first movie up to the latest fifth movie. I'm even happier that I actually managed to snatch actually a Ghostface mask. I actually managed to snatch two. I got a cheaper one in like the city in which I live, and I got a less cheap one, but the one that's more accurate to the costume from actually ordering it online. And I'll actually show you the more accurate one with my best Ghostface impression. Hello guys, this is in essence my Ghostface costume. I mean, it's nothing to be too proud of, but I think if you've watched the movies, you'll probably get the gist of what this is trying to represent. I mean, it's not going to scare Sydney or anything, but at the end of the day, what is going to scare Sydney? Sydney is a pretty tough, like, scream queen, so we're not gonna try and do anything weird with Sydney Prescott right now, but from the time of which I've gotten into horror, there has been a lot of new movies and a lot of really, really great like pieces of literature as well out there. Like for example, when it comes to movies, there are some modern takes on the classics which are really good. For example, I think personally that the Thing remake, or not the remake, but actually it was more of a modern prequel on the original movie. I think it came out in like 2011. That was a really great movie about like the Thing. And of course, there are like modern movies which I really like the fact that the latest Scream movie references this, which by the way, it isn't a spoiler. Basically, that like a lot of audience have these more posh or more elevated type of horror movies nowadays, like The Witch or The Babadook, Hereditary, or a lot of these, especially A24 like produced movies, which honestly, even though they might seem a bit more pretentious, they're actually really good horror stuff. But especially personally, really like The Witch. It was a nice psychological thriller in which you don't really know whether or not something supernatural is truly happening. Highly recommended, by the way. But I've talked about cinema a lot, and this channel is primarily actually a book channel. So you're wondering, where am I going to actually talk about the books? Well, I did eventually get into like horror literature as well, though of course I wanted to talk about movies, as actually movies are what really got me into horror. But I did discover some great literature pieces which basically determined for me that, oh, I think I really like horror literature as well. One of the main ones is actually before all of what I've just said about movies, and that is one particular series of books called The Horror Bus, and it's actually a Dutch book. Written by the author Paul van Loon. The original title of this in Dutch is The Griezelbus, and this series basically is one of my favorites. It's one of my guilty pleasures, and I do feel like reading it again, like even as like an adult right now, because I remember this being a very fun thing to read when I was back in elementary school. It was basically a story in which you have these school kids basically going on a bus trip, and this bus trip basically takes off. Like, I don't know if you've seen the old Nightmare on Elm Street 2 movie, the start of that movie at least, in which like the bus trip kind of takes off and drives like in the middle of the desert, and things start to get really weird and creepy. Well, basically that's kind of like the whole premise of this book, at least the first one. I haven't read all of the series actually. As a matter of fact, I have not even read the whole of the second book, to be honest, hence why I kind of want to revisit it. But from what I remember of the first book, it was basically that this bus takes off, and it's basically being driven by a chauffeur skeleton, and there's this creepy guy with like a coat that has different like human bones, which is kind of messed up for a children's book, and he basically tells them like 10 terrifying tales. It was basically from what I gather, a lot of people had like goosebumps as their like introduction to horror when they were kids. For me, I had the horror buzz, and it was a great introduction to horror, in my opinion, of at least horror literature. Basically, exposure to stuff like the horror buzz kind of made me think, I really like thriller. Back then, I thought, oh, I like suspenseful thriller books. Like when it comes to like, I didn't really think too much about horror back when I was a little child. But of course, getting like older, basically I started to learn especially about Stephen King, and I've seen some great Stephen King movie adaptations, such as of course the It miniseries, in which like you have this great, especially the first part of the It miniseries, these great sequences with basically Tim Curry as Pennywise the clown. And that kind of brought me, especially after the year of 2017. I think it's also about around the year basically which I started making my YouTube channel for this exact reason. So I'm tying it all in. Basically, when I think it was a year in which a lot of Stephen King like adaptations were happening. Like you had the It movie, the first It movie, like that we had in the theater, and also the Dark Tower movie, which came out with Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey, which even though die-hard like Stephen King fans and a lot of other people didn't like it, it was kind of a guilty pleasure for me. And of course, I think there were a lot of like series being adapted as well. Like a lot of Stephen King stuff were happening like in between 2017 and like you could say even till now, but especially in between 2017 and 2020. So I naturally became curious to start reading more Stephen King stuff, and it's partially why I created like my YouTube channel, because I wanted to get through the entirety of the Dark Tower series, since like after having seen the movie, it actually motivated me to want to read the book, or the books at least. And I didn't just want to read the Dark Tower books, I wanted to read every Stephen King tie-in I could find to the Dark Tower book. And I found this really awesome picture, which I don't know if I can find it, but maybe if I do, I will put it here. But I found a picture which basically showed how a lot of the Stephen King books kind of allude to like a concept that is in the Dark Tower, and basically from that you can create this very complex diagram, since Stephen King basically created this whole universe, or this whole multiverse, you could say, off of his books. And after basically getting into Stephen King, I discovered horror literature more profoundly. So besides Stephen King, I discovered like some of the classic literature pieces as well. Like one of which I've already read, like by that point, was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which even though it has some horror elements, I do not consider it fully horror. I discovered stuff like The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, which was a really great read, and also some other stuff out there. I've read The Red Dragon book by Thomas Harris, which is phenomenal, and I think by far, basically, like from the Mindhunter movie to the Red Dragon book with to the Red Dragon movie with Anthony Hopkins, and the Hannibal series, like I think the most accurate representation of at least the feeling which I got with reading the Red Dragon book was actually the series with Matt Mikkelsen as Hannibal Lecter. Like, I might be a bit biased because I was watching that series almost simultaneously as I was reading the Red Dragon book, but I felt like at least having watched all of those three like adaptations of the Red Dragon story, that the TV show like did it much better, like I think in comparison to everything, especially like with Will Graham and basically how we got into the mindset of the killers and such. It's very unfortunate that the series, that particular series canceled. Like I always wanted to see how they like adapt certain, like especially the Silence of the Lambs storyline with Clarice and such in the series, but only like we can only imagine. I have a similar testament even with the Dark Tower, like because the 2017 movie bombed so hard, it became really hard and almost no one wants to basically try and give a shot at the Dark Tower, even though like it having a great amount of content. I was super excited basically when I started reading The Dark Tower and actually really getting into it, as I discovered that, oh shoot, the books are actually pretty damn good, I became really sad that there were no Dark Tower adaptations happening until I heard that like the Amazon basically was adapting The Wizard and Glass, which is basically the fourth book of the Dark Tower series, but it basically jumps into the origin story of the gunslinger. And I was really happy. I even saw, like, I think about last year, I saw some pictures of the season premiere of the basically that Amazon series would have looked like, and it actually looked very, very promising. So I'm very sad that the Dark Tower isn't happening, but basically all of this ranting basically summarizes to basically Stephen King having introduced me to more horror like literature out there, from fantasy horror, or you could say even dark fantasy, to more sci-fi horror, even though I haven't explored that genre too much, psychological thrillers, which I do really enjoy. Like I do even like what I read occasionally of like Yo Nesbo. I don't know if I pronounce his name right, or Yo Nesbo. But I do like, especially like some of the tints and flavors of like Scandinavian thrillers. Those are always really good. Ludin Ratakoma In is a Swedish book, Let the Right One In, that is particularly really, the story of that is really good. And there are like two movie adaptations, one called like Let Me In with Chloe Grace Moretz, and a Swedish one which I highly recommend as well. The Swedish one I remember being even creepier than the American one, Let Me In. So if you want to watch one of those, watch the Swedish one. It has this very dark, like Scandinavian wintry setup, and it's basically about vampires. So all in all, I've mentioned a bunch of stuff, and I know this video is a little bit of a decluttered mess, but it was basically me trying to share basically how I got into horror, since I wanted to make something for Halloween, and I really like this, like going through the motions and reminiscing, especially as I've like very recently watched like the movie franchise, which really made me fall in love with horror, and that is the Scream franchise. So I really felt like making this because I perhaps maybe one of you or some of you might even relate with like this movie having inspired you to really like horror, or something of which I've mentioned. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see more of you very soon, and stay tuned of course for more videos as always. Remember to enjoy your Halloween, as you never know when you might do a very wrong movie trivia and might end up being your last Halloween. And of course, if you haven't liked and subscribed to my channel already, I should not have to remind you twice. If you like this again, feel free to like, subscribe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye. Jesus, this thing gets really sweaty. Whew, yeah. Alright, spoof's over, guys. Enjoy the rest of your the weekend, day, and Halloween again.